And whenever you're ready to go, you go.
All right. Ready? Thank you. Hi, and thank you to anybody who is here in real time. Thanks for signing into Lunch and Learn today. My name is Mary Little. I'm Director of Disability Services, and I also serve as the ADA Coordinator for our campus. I'm going to talk about reframing disability. So I want to start by thanking Dr. Chastity Cooper for the invitation to participate in the Lunch and Learn and talk about disability. Just as a quick housekeeping thing, I want to let you know that we are providing captioning for this meeting, and it is being provided by our vendor, who are called Alternative Communication Services. If you have difficulty accessing the closed captioning, if you'll email our interim accessibility coordinator, and his contact is there at the bottom, his name is Prashant. If you email him, he will send you a hyperlink for the stream text, and you would click on that and you would see it in a different window, but you would have the captioning. Captioning is, we're going to talk about it as part of the reframe towards access with disabilities. But I wanted particularly to mention it because you probably already know that Zoom does not provide a real-time captioning feature. It records and you can have the transcript. If you are teaching a class where you're using it that way as recorded classes posted with the transcript, please do edit your transcript for accuracy. It uses an app called Otter, which is not a real person. ACS is a real person. Otherwise it's a software, so it has a limited ability to be as accurate as a real person does. If you have a student this semester who is hearing impaired, they'll work with my office to request captioning. We'll be in touch with you as faculty members to let you know that that's a thing, and that'll be happening, and that we'll provide it, and what you would need to do on your end. So the other thing, give a shout out to Kim and say thank you. Kim agreed to monitor the chat box, so if anybody had a question or comment, a lively discussion is always welcome. So, proceed that way. So, in thinking about how to talk about reshaping, rethinking, or reframing disability, that's a lot of ground. And so I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of how I intend to address it for today. I want to talk a little bit about history and our evolving view of disability. I want to talk about how language and media play into our frames, both as it shapes them and validates them. We'll talk about the disability models, the predominant disability models that have been out there and are out there. But ultimately, we want to focus our attention on moving from a place of exclusion for people with disabilities to a broad inclusion mindset. So we want to be planning for access, which will take us to a conversation about universal design. So to start, oh gosh, this thing. I just wanted to share a few people who played some significant roles in the history of disability. I went back and forth really about whether I should include Geraldo Rivera on here. Ultimately, I didn't because he wasn't part of lawmaking, but he did play an extremely important role as it relates to the philosophy of hiding people with disabilities away. We have a history of institutionalizing people, whether you were a person with a mobility impairment, blind. It just didn't matter. Down syndrome, everybody was sent to institutions, and the care was deplorable. It's actually shocking If you go back and look at some of the photographs, he went inside an institution called Willowbrook State School, which is in Staten Island. And it was kind of a shocking expose type of story, but it did result in a class action suit that took a lot of people that were institutionalized out of the institution to live in a more of a supported living sort of arrangement. So that's sort of in the background. These people here are significant to the laws as they've evolved. There's a really great movie, if you're interested. It's called Crypt Camp, and it's on Netflix. And it talks about, it's a documentary type of thing, but there was a camp for young people with disabilities in the Catskills called Camp Gen Ed. And a lot of the people who were at that camp in 1970 went on to play really significant roles politically as it relates to some of the subsequent laws. So on the top left is a photo of Judith Heumann, who was highly instrumental in the passage of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is really the first major piece of legislation. It's primarily anti-discriminatory. It basically says no person can be discriminated against purely on the basis of disability by any organization that's receiving federal funding, which is like tons of people, tons of organizations, including schools. So Judith Heumann is a major figure in all of that. On the bottom are two photos side by side of a gentleman named Ed Roberts, who features in the independent living movement. So the first picture shows him, he had polio and was paralyzed from the neck down. He's shown, I'm not sure if the man with him is an attendant or a friend, but it does look like he is holding a service dog. And in the second picture, it's a close-up of Ed with a sign behind him saying civil rights for the disabled. So he's another major player. And then in the upper right is a photo of Justin Dart, who is frequently said to be the father of ADA. He's shown with the cowboy hat. You almost always see him wearing. So it's a nice time to be having this conversation about disability, reframing disability, looking at where we've been and where we're going, because this is the 30th anniversary of the signing of ADA. And so this is a photograph of President George H.W. Bush signing ADA into legislation on July 26, 1990. So in 12 days will be the official 30th anniversary. He signed it with a very famous quote of saying, "Let the shameful walls of exclusion come tumbling down," which some have come down and we still have a ways to go. On the president's right, which looks like the left of the photo, is Evan Kemp, who was the chairman of the EOC at the time. And on the right is Justin Dart, who interestingly is the grandson of the founder of Walgreens. And that's interesting because Walgreens continues to be a pretty disability-friendly employer. They've taken on a lot of initiatives as it relates to employment with people with disabilities. Their distribution center, which I believe is in South Carolina, hires a lot of young people with autism and Down syndrome. And they undertook a similar initiative in Knoxville a couple of years ago. So I feel certain it is due to Justin having been in the family. So to start talking about our frame of disability, our frame is how we view things, how we talk about things. That frame or that lens is going to influence our policies and our practices. So if you do a quick Google of disability, this is pretty much what you see. Lots of pictures of people in wheelchairs, lots of pictures of blind people using a cane. It's a little misleading because for the most part, the vast majority of disabilities are in fact invisible. So it's the minority of disabilities that would be readily obvious when you're interacting with someone. In addition to mobility impairments or sensory disabilities like blind and deaf, there are a lot of people who have chronic medical types of disabilities, things like diabetes or cancer. I personally have been a little surprised at the number of students we see with chronic medical conditions, celiac, Crohn's, that sort of thing. Plus, there's all the mental health disabilities, which are also not readily apparent to be chatting or working with a person. Lots of depression, anxiety, PTSD. And then there are the educationally related disabilities like learning disabilities and ADHD. So the CDC says well over 95% of disabilities are invisible. So this is a little bit misleading, but because it is how we tend to view things, the stick figure in the wheelchair is indeed the international symbol of access. So currently, where we are right now is what we would consider a medical model of disability. We're evolving away, but we still have our feet firmly over here in many ways. Prior to a medical model, we had more of one that was a charity sort of pity kind of model. And as we moved away from that, although there's elements of that perception still out there, we moved to a view that takes the position that the person is the problem, or that the problem lies within the person, that the person needs a cure, the problem needs to be fixed. Doctors are involved, specialists are involved. It's that kind of position, lots of language like, the person's deficit, the person's limitation, impairment. And so what that does is kind of give rise between that view and the laws that have been passed. We've developed kind of a compliance approach. What needs to be done to fix this person's problem at this event, in this building, in this class, that sort of thing. So, it leaves the person with a disability very much in kind of a less than role by being treated as if there's something wrong with them or as if there's something that needs to be fixed. It ultimately reflects a real spirit of ableism, which devalues and discriminates against people with disabilities. Dr. Amanda Krause at the University of Arizona talks quite a bit about language and media and how that plays into developing a frame and validating a frame. And I want to share some of that with you. And there's some language that perpetuates negative stereotypes, and some of it's really obvious, like crippled or handicapped. But there's still a lot of language out there. People continue to say things like she suffered from, or he's confined to a wheelchair, that sort of thing. The phrase able-bodied is not the opposite of disabled. The disability community takes the position that non-disabled is the natural opposite. So using phrases like able-bodied, again, puts it one up, one down sort of philosophy. There's a lot of just euphemistic expressions like blind as a bat, turning a blind eye, it's so lame, that are disability based. And I think we do well to check that when we hear ourselves say things like that or think that or somebody else. The other thing I want to point out is some of this stuff like handicapped, and I hear that all the time. I work really hard to have people move away from that phrase, because it's actually born out of the charity model of disability, which takes the view that people with disabilities are to be pitied. They're going to need lots of support, whether that's through services or financial support. And we had Jerry Lewis's telethon on TV annually for many, many years that served to perpetuate that very view. But the word handicap comes from the concept of cap in hand, the person with a disability begging for money. So it's a seriously negative term. So as people attempt to maybe do better, and there's good intention in this, but there's still some language that also gives a negative view of disability. So when you have phrases like disability or handicapable, lots of times you'll hear people said to be physically challenged, or they have special needs, they're differently able. All of these things give the idea that, you know, disability is so horrible we don't even want to say the word. We're going to like tiptoe around that to never even acknowledge that the person is a person with a disability. Dr. Krause talks about special needs in particular and says she is a wheelchair user and says that her needs are not any different than anybody else's needs, and the point is well made. People with disabilities need to drive their cars here, park somewhere, make their way to class. They have need to go to a movie, a bookstore, the dining hall. There's nothing special about what they need to do. So we might want to rethink that one. So taking it a step further, for a long time, and I know my background is in vocational rehabilitation, so this was definitely the thing. We were trained in person first language. So rather than saying, you know, a disabled person, you're going to say it's a person with a disability. And again, it's a situation where the intent is positive. It's to acknowledge the individual rather than disability, but it also separates the person from disability, and many in the disability community claim disability and their specific disability as identity. It's part of who they are. It's an important part of who they are. So many deaf people, blind people, many people are happy to be identified as that. It's not everybody, so I think we're still sort of in this mix of which is better. And I think that speaks ultimately to saying that no two people with disabilities are the same, like no two people are the same at all. So when in doubt, it's best to ask the person what their preference is. Taking a look at images from media, if I can move my mouse over here, we'll look at that. We can see how disability has been portrayed in media, and again, it's not very flattering. It varies from pitiable to frightening to, in the case of Me Before You, which kind of was popular just a couple of years ago, and I can't say I actually did see it, but a lot of people in the disability community took real exception with that movie because it's giving the message that disability is basically so terrible, it's not, their life is not worth living. $1 Million Baby is the same thing. But working from the upper left is a picture of the Joker from the Batman movie as played by Joaquin Phoenix, which certainly gives a rather scary view of mental health. And if we go clockwise, the next photo is that from The Shape of Water, which in that movie, the young woman did not have language, and she was so outside of her culture, she has a love affair with a creature from another world. And to the right of that is Elephant Man, which did little really to talk about this man's disability, but it certainly did serve to illustrate tragedy and scariness. He was so scary to view, he wore the covering over himself lest he upset somebody by their having seen him. Below that is Me For You, and to the left of that is a picture of Tiny Tim in A Christmas Carol, which is kind of your quintessential stereotype of a young child with a disability, but he's ever the optimist despite disability. So there's some of that language yet again. So real negative sorts of images and perceptions about people with disabilities and what it means to be a person with a disability. And if you don't know that you are interacting with people with disabilities because it's not obvious to you, you might be holding some of these thoughts and ideas without even really being aware that you are. Sorry, my mouse is, I don't know what it's doing. On the flip side of othering people through language that's pitying or that sort of thing is disability as inspiration, which again is like one of these well-meaning things, but is equally damaging for people with disabilities. A lot of negative stereotypes are put out there and disguised as compliments. Amy Oulton, who has done a TED Talk about her experience with a disability, talks about how negative stereotypes are put on her and they're sort of disguised as a compliment. She gives the example of, you're so stylish for a person in a wheelchair. Or, and both she and, this is a photo of Stella Young, who's a comedian from Australia, and they both talk about these images of, gosh, you'd never know you're disabled, you're out here having a good time. All these inspirational, pithy sorts of things, you know, against all odds, putting out the stereotype that people with disabilities overcome their disability to do things and participate. And that's not exactly how that is. They're engaged in life like the rest of us, and disability is a part of that for them, but they're not overcoming anything. Stella refers to this as inspiration porn, the objectification of people with disabilities for the sake of non-disabled people. And says it's equally as damaging to people with disabilities, because the message is like, gosh, I'm so glad to not have a disability like yours. I mean, this is like a really negative message for the person with the disability, and it's really inappropriate to. And I've heard people say things like this. You know, gosh, it really puts my problems into perspective. So getting a check on that, if it's something that you're thinking or you hear, can help us make a move to a more progressive sort of view of people with disabilities and their place in society. So the emerging thinking or the emerging model on disability is the social model. And the social model puts its focus on the environment. It's the environment that poses a barrier. The problem doesn't lie with the person. The problem lies with the environment. So a person can have an impairment, but they're disabled by the environment. So it's very much a civil rights, social justice sort of view. It's a view that's very inclusive. It kind of levels the playing field because we're all in the environment and we're all interacting with it slightly differently. Inherent in the message is that access is a right. It's a right we all have, and we should all have that expectation. So this is a photograph of a man named Michael Hainson, and I just wanted to share this because it's kind of a twist really on how the environment can be the disabling factor for people. He was a regional sales manager for a company called Quantum. They're some kind of video storing and management company. And he worked in the Twin Towers when they were bombed. He worked on the 78th floor and had worked there for a period of years. Pictured here is one of his guide dogs. He's had a number of them over the years. And he would go to work with the assistance of his guide dog daily and go about his business. On the day that the Twin Towers were hit, a unique situation occurred for everybody, and that everybody was thrown into complete blackness. There's no electricity. People were confused. They were off the norm. For Michael, being in darkness, that wasn't new or different. That was daily. And the dog, who was highly trained, remained calm. And so as she guided him to the stairs, because he was well aware in emergency, don't take the elevator, take the stairs. As she guided him towards the stairs, there were all sorts of people milling around going, what do we do, what do we do? And they basically kind of formed a train behind him. And his dog escorted himself, as well as I think 30 some odd people, down over 1,400 stairs to safety on the street. So that's just an example of how people without disabilities suddenly found themselves with a disability because of an environmental situation. But he was certainly a hero that day, and he's kind of an interesting person. He spoke at Walter State a couple years ago and has a book out called Thunder Dog about this experience. So when we start recognizing things like that, and we want to make a shift, we want to move to that mindset of more of a social justice kind of an issue. And so we want to move away from language that invokes pity or fear or suggests any of that sort of one up, one down. We want to use neutral, descriptive language, carefully analyzing and critiquing the images that we expose ourselves and others to in media and storylines. Watching for microaggressions, and this is kind of an interesting thing because other fields discuss microaggressions and they're sometimes a little bit tricky, but I can give you an example for the field of disability, and that would be the expectations we have of students. So oftentimes in a well-meaning kind of way, a teacher might assist a student with a disability. They want to see them succeed. They want them to do well. But they're doing that with sort of a secret, unspoken belief that the student can't do it on their own. They can't do it without their help. They're going to have that little bit of an extra edge, which is a demeaning and negative message for a highly capable person with a disability. So you want to make sure you're holding students to the same expectations, disability and all. And this is kind of going to lead us into very naturally a discussion of universal design and how that might work in the educational field. Universal design comes out of the field of architecture. It was put out by an architect named Ronald Mace, who had polio and used a wheelchair. And he promoted the idea that physical spaces be designed for the broadest imaginable group of users. So when you're thinking about the building and how we're going to get in and how we're going to get out, imagining all of the people who might use that building. And what you start seeing is that a lot of things that may impact people with disabilities are going to impact other people as well. So a lot of older buildings in particular have, very imposing staircases at the entrance, which poses a problem for people with mobility limitations for sure, but it also poses a problem for elderly people, somebody maybe with a baby carriage, that sort of thing. So Ronald Mace proposed the universal design concept with the emphasis that good design is always so much better, looks better, is cheaper than the retrofit that is likely to be needed. The principles of universal design, which are on the left of this slide, include equitable use, meaning everybody can use it. Flexibility, you know, there may be different ways to use it. That it be simple and intuitive. How to use it is somewhat obvious. The information about it is perceptible regardless of how you might engage with information. There's a tolerance for error, which is sort of relates to that flexibility. It should take low physical effort, and its size and shape should relate directly to its purpose and function. On the right are two pictures of the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California. It houses a variety of offices, one of which is the California Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. But the point of the photos that I selected to show, which come from their website, is that it's beautiful. I mean, it's very modern. It shows the helical ramp, they call it, which goes around the middle space. It allows access by people with canes, walkers, wheelchairs, on foot, however. It provides easy access and safe egress in case of emergency. The center space is gray, surrounded by concentric tan area. And that sort of thing serves to give a cue to a blind person. A lot of blind people can see shadows or colors, but even where they don't, sometimes there's a variation in texture that their cane can pick up. So it looks attractive, it serves a function. Nobody's at a less than kind of place when they're in this space. And one of the architects in a video on their site commented that universal design is an opportunity to be creative and to open the world for more people, which I thought was an exceedingly beautiful way of expressing that, and a concept that can easily be brought to education. And this is kind of a little cartoon, just a little levity here on universal access. Shows a picture of a bunch of children standing in what is probably a school. It's all covered in snow, and we had the man out there shoveling the snow. And the child in the wheelchair says, "Could you please shovel the ramp?" He says, "Sure, as soon as I get these stairs shoveled off, I'll do the ramp. These guys are waiting." And the student in the wheelchair points out that if you shovel the ramp, everybody can get in. So that's a point well made, and you start looking at buildings and you think, why do we have stairs there? Why not just a little ramp? There are so many buildings that have stairs, and then the ramp that's been retrofitted, they're really unattractive. It makes for a really unattractive entrance in many cases. The ramps are not well done. They can be dangerous without a railing, just a variety of things. So good design on the front end is going to avoid all of that. And if we think about the broad use, sure, we can all use a ramp, for instance. But moving that into higher ed, we can take the same principles from the architectural field into the education and look at designing for the broadest imaginable group of students. This is going to make for equitable use, flexible use. It removes stigma for students with disabilities. It's good for everybody, in short. I want to point out that Phil Smith has a really terrific presentation on UDL on the Center for Teaching Excellence website that has, deeper information about how to apply that than I would cover here. So I think the main thing that we would want to say and take away as a general statement is plan for access. Let's plan for access on the front end and avoid a lot of the retrofits later. So some of the things that I might suggest to faculty would be to provide handouts in advance if that's at all possible. create digital content that's accessible, and that's super important right now, given we've been online and will be again later in the fall. So captioning videos, and if you need any help with that, Rob Nelson is a resource, as we are here in Disability Services. So if you need help captioning something, reach out for sure. Ensure your online materials accessible with a screen reader. A lot of people will Xerox articles and then, you know, scan them and upload them. And when it's done that way, it's done as an image, not as text. So a screen reader, as might be used by a blind person, doesn't read any of that. It just says it's an image and that's all they know about it. So you want to be sure that your documents can be read with a screen reader. And Anthony over in ATS is a big resource with that. Plan for access when you're selecting your textbooks. So if there's a textbook that provides an audio version, I would love it if you always chose that. Same with ebooks. We do work with a company to provide those to students if needed, if they're not an option at the time of purchase, so that's out there as well. We also create Braille materials for blind students, so if you have a blind student in your class, please, you know, get with us and as much in advance as possible. And again, we will reach out to you if a blind student is expected to be in your class. Please use the microphone. I'm always surprised by the numbers of really faculty, staff, as well as students who ask me to ask a supervisor or a professor to please use the microphone in class. Use the microphone, and please don't turn your back on people when you're talking to write on the board. All just little things that can be done on the front end to make it easier for all users. This picture is the home page of something called the Accessible Syllabus Project, which is out of Tulane University. I found it really interesting. It just provides a lot of information about accessibility and kind of an inclusive approach in preparing materials. So you can see there are 4 circles. One is image, one is text, one is rhetoric, and one is policy. So under image, there's information about how images can be used to convey information perhaps more effectively than words do, or to do it in addition to words for people who prefer it that way. One of the examples they suggested is showing the distribution of grades in a pie chart, which I thought was really kind of good because that would probably be a lot easier to digest than when it's reported as percentages. So that kind of caught my eye. There's a lot of information under text about not only font choice for ease of reading, but how to, you know, layout choices and how that impacts usability. Under rhetoric, they talk about some of the things you might see on a policy. And the one that caught my eye is frequently it'll say things like late work will be discounted by 60%, or, you know, your grade will be reduced by 40% if it's late, which you could say it like that, or you could say that late work is eligible for 60% of the original grade, which is somewhat more positive and less threatening. So it has a lot of information like that. Additionally, under policy, there's information such as inclusive learning statements for syllabi. So it was really an interesting resource, and I hope you'll take a look at it at some point. But I just share this example with you, you know, the introduction that we all have different learning styles, and if there's something that prevents you or excludes you, you know, to get with you, you can find a workaround. And if it's a matter of you know, a formal accommodation that would come through our office. They call it an official accommodation. So when we take that kind of approach, we're moving away from what do I have to do and moving to what can I do? How can I bring all students into this sphere? So this cartoon, I've seen many times, but slightly different. So this cartoon shows three people trying to see a baseball game, but they are behind a fence. So the shortest person is behind the fence and can't see anything. And the medium-sized person, in most of the originals that I see, cannot see anything either. And then the tall person can barely see over the fence. They're presented with an equal accommodation. Each person will get the same thing. They'll each have a box to stand on. And that's where this particular set of cartoons begins. Each person is standing on the same size box. So for the short person, it doesn't move them above the fence at all. The medium person can now see the game. And the tall person, who could see to begin with, is now, you know, at waist level of the fence. So we recognize maybe that's not working. We move to a more equitable solution, which is shown in the next cartoon. Same three people. This time, the tall person is just standing on their feet because they can see the game, not a problem. The medium-sized person is on one box, can see the game. The short person now has two boxes and can now see. So this is like the equitable solution, in that we're going to address each person's needs individually. It's not a one-size-fits-all. This particular cartoon takes it one step further. Let's remove the fence. Let's get rid of the fence and replace it with a chain link fence, a fence that everybody can see through. So the barrier's been removed and there's no need for any type of accommodation. Everybody can see the game. So I especially appreciated this cartoon because it is taking it that one step further to say, let's remove the barriers altogether. So in summary, what we want to do is move to a spirit of inclusion. We want to develop that spirit of inclusion in ourselves and promote that in our workplaces and classrooms and everywhere else we go. And so towards that end, we would want to honor disability as a natural part of diversity and honor people with disabilities as being a part of the natural, diverse community. One of the earlier lunch and learns that I looked at, I think it was Amy Johnson's, and I think Dr. Diggs said something about acknowledging that students are the experts on their own experience. And that would certainly be the case when we seek to develop a spirit of inclusion, to acknowledge disability and to acknowledge that person's experience in the world. Planning for people with disabilities sets a welcoming tone. When a person with a disability doesn't have to ask for everything, they don't have to demonstrate eligibility for everything. That's a welcoming kind of atmosphere. And so we set the tone by planning. We set the tone through our language, the language that we use ourselves and that we allow others to use. We want to move to that neutral, descriptive sorts of language, removing barriers whenever possible. When we see them and we can, let's remove the barriers. And I guess just to, as a final note, I would want to say to everybody that disability services is a resource for faculty every bit as much as we are a resource for students with disabilities. So if you need help with developing materials, you want to make a Braille document, you want to check your document if it is accessible. We've got JAWS as a screen reader on a number of computers here and in the library, and that will be available to you. So by all means, please reach out. We're happy to assist you in removing barriers for the students here at ETSU. So, and that's what I have. I thank you for tuning in. There's a couple of pages of resources and references that I'm happy to share.
Mary, if you could just repeat the name of that movie that you referred to early on, and also the name of the book. People in the comments were commenting about that. And
sure. The movie is called CRIP, C-R-I-P, CRIP Camp, and it's on Netflix. And the book is called Thunderdog, and it's by Michael Hingson, Hingson.
thank you. Also, will you be providing me with a copy of your PowerPoint?
Yes,
I could send it to those that participated. So
sure.
If I don't have your email address and you don't get a copy, please email the Office of Equity and Inclusion, and we'll be sure that you get a copy. This session is also being recorded, so if you would like to get a copy of the recording, I can forward that to you as well as to any of your colleagues. And if anybody has any questions for Mary, please.
I have a comment if I can.
Sure.
Just in the interest of accuracy,
Mm-hmm.
the etymology of handicap is not begging with a cap in your hand. That's a common myth.
Interesting. So I read that in several different, people with disabilities sorts of documents. So what is the origin?
It's a little hard to explain, but it's a gambling game from, I think, the 17th century that involved the players taking their hands out of the cap, and they would be either full or empty, and has somewhat complicated rules. The short story that's clearest is on etymonline.com, like etym, like etymology, and then online, but it's all one word.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I'll type the website in the chat.
Sure. How did it become associated with disability, did they say?
Oh, that's a common phenomenon. It's called, shoot, I forget the name of that. It's when people, folk etymology it's called, when it sounds like that's what it should have come from. It makes sense for that's what it should have come from. So somebody says it and then everybody believes it. That happens all the time.
Interesting. Well, I know an awful lot of people with disabilities who have been saying that for a long time. Anyway, okay. I'll enjoy looking at that website though, because I like words.
Hey, Mary, Keith Johnson. I know last semester, in March, we were like shuffled off campus pretty quick to start our online classes. And obviously during the semester prior to getting out and previous semesters, we typically would get, information from disability services saying, well, these could be reasonable accommodations for students. I guess my question is, for the folks who are here, what were the biggest challenges by us going online with students who had some disabilities? Because I would imagine that some students who were not identified with having disabilities in our classes may have had some disabilities once we went online. And what advice would you give us if worst case scenario does happen? The numbers of positive COVID-19 cases continue to rise, and we have to make a decision to go online. What's the best advice you can give us regarding students who we may have in our classes with some type of disability?
Yeah, so there were a couple of things that sort of rose to the top really quick, one of which was the captioning. We were doing our classes in Zoom. They weren't captioned because it can't be. and the transcripts are not, or people don't always know to correct them. We have a number of students who are hard of hearing, have hearing loss, and do rely on lip reading to some degree, as well as deaf people. And so the captioning became really important. And so we are now working with ACS towards that end. So that's something I would keep in mind. Like I say, that would come through our office, but even if it doesn't, and you're just using recordings, I would urge everybody to edit the transcripts before they put that out there. So that was really huge. Another thing that I got a lot of calls about were students who, as you said, may not have even registered with us, didn't have accommodations, and were managing themselves, but maybe have diagnoses like ADD, ADHD, and really struggled with sort of the lack of structure that they were then experiencing on a completely online program. And we developed strategies like, even if it is Zoom recordings, go to class the same time as you did. Watch those recordings according to your class schedule. So I think anything that you can do that's going to provide continuity in terms of that is really helpful to a lot of students. And putting the information out there in as many different ways as possible. You know, so many students rely on that face-to-face situation, and then, you know, they're sort of floating out in the atmosphere. So anything that you can do that builds that engagement and provides continuity is going to be really beneficial for a whole lot of students. A lot of disabilities saw that as a concern. So those were the two things that kind of rose to the top. Also, the testing situation. We have a lot of students who have time and a half. And so some faculty members are more comfortable in D2L making those changes than others. But again, we can help, and ATS can help. But that was another thing that people didn't necessarily have to fool with before we went online, and then suddenly we were fooling with it. So those are some of the things that come to my mind right away that we saw a lot of.
Mary, this is Phyllis. Thank you for the presentation. This has been really, really wonderful and enlightening. I learned a lot today. I had a quick question about, you mentioned scanning of articles.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm scanning them and just putting them in D2L for my students, then you said that they were images, so now they can't be used for a screen reader. And you mentioned Anthony over at ATS. Is there a process that I can do so I don't have to bother Anthony to do those? Is it a particular type of scanning, or is this something that I need to work with ATS to get my articles? Because in one of my classes in the fall, I have quite a few articles that are going to be on D2L.
Okay. No, it depends on when you scan them, how you save them, because PDF can be saved. It doesn't have to be saved as an image. That's one of the choices. But if you opt the other way, then it can be read with a screen reader. And the screen readers vary. There's a lot of them out there. JAWS almost is kind of like an industry standard, but it's also super expensive. But it's a good place to test it with if you want to try any of yours. NVDA is a free one that a lot of people use. So it depends on how you save it. And sometimes you don't always get the option of saving it as PDF text, I think it's called. But if you can, that's what you want, because then you can read it.
Save it as a PDF.
Well, as the PDF, is it PDF text? Is that as opposed to a PDF image?
Okay.
You don't want image.
Okay.
Don't pick image. But sometimes you don't get the choice, and that's the only way it saves. And when you scan, a lot of times that's the way it does. So, yeah, we've had a lot of documents brought here that we actually had to retype to create the Word document in order to make a Braille document or useful with the screen readers.
Thank you, Mary. And
Mhm.
thank you, Tammy, too.
And you can export, if you have it as a PDF, you can export it to Word. You'll have to do a lot of cleanup, which is usually better done by a faculty member who is a content specialist, but that can be done also. And then you can just save it as a document, a Word document.
I have a comment about the accessibility in PDFs.
Mhm.
I was just checking. I had to do this for our website.
Mhm.
We had a lot of PDFs at one point that weren't in the right accommodations for accessibility. But in Adobe Reader or Adobe Acrobat Pro, you can actually run an accessibility report. Do you all use that? And do you know, is it accurate if you?
I've not ever assessed its accuracy, but I do know it's there. Adobe also has its own reader, so it'll read things. It's real sort of mechanical sounding, or robot sounding. It's not as smooth as a lot of other screen readers or the text-to-speech readers are, but it does have those functions. So. Well, if anybody else has any comments, I'm happy, call me up or shoot me an email. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about reframing disability. I think people with disabilities are sort of, it's one of the largest protected groups of people, and late coming to the whole equity conversation. So I'm delighted to be a part of the group here on campus, and happy to have an opportunity to talk about it with others too. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you.
Okay.
Y'all have a good day.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye. Okay.